With Peter Sissons in London and George Alagaya in New York. It's 10 o'clock.
America and her friends pause to remember the New York victims. The president visits the scene and promises America will respond. Grim and getting grimmer, heavy rain hampers the rescuers. In Washington and across America, tears and prayer. The Queen leads Britain's mourning after 3 minutes of silence. And Tony Blair brings back MPs to tell them it's time to stand up to the terrorist fanatics.
On the United States.
Good evening. After the shock, the anger and the incredulity, a day to grieve, a pause to draw strength. In cathedrals, chapels and open spaces across America and throughout the democratic world, people quietly remembered the thousands whose lives were snuffed out in Tuesday's fanatical onslaught. Tonight, President Bush is visiting what's left of the World Trade Center just hours after calling up 50,000 reservists for active military duty. The manhunt continues without rest. The names of all 19 hijackers in the 4 doomed planes are now known. Here, the Queen led Britain's mourning, while the Prime Minister pledged Britain's unconditional support during America's time of trial and tragedy. It's to America we go first. For the President, the visit to the scene was much more than a chance to see the devastation for himself. It's an opportunity to capture the mood of the nation and to show his determination to lead what he's called the first war of the 21st century. For our first report, here's our special correspondent, Ben Brown.
President Bush flew into New York to see for himself the scene of Tuesday's catastrophe. They have renamed this part of the city. Now they call it Ground Zero. President Bush spoke to rescue workers, men who have searched for survivors relentlessly but usually fruitlessly. Mr. Bush has seen all this on television, of course, but not first-hand. It is a sight no peacetime president can ever have dreamt he would see, not in his worst nightmares. Heavy rain has been pelting down since last night, turning the dust here into mud, destabilising shaky buildings and hampering the rescue effort.
Things have to proceed more carefully, more cautiously. At the same time, they're going on because there is still a strong hope that we'll be able to recover people and find people and save them.
Hello?
A rescue worker calls out amid the rubble, hoping for a miracle.
Anyone there?
But after this disaster, miracles seem to be in short supply. On New York's Lexington Avenue, a pitiful sight. Relatives of the missing putting up photographs of their loved ones, hoping against hope that someone somewhere may have seen them alive. Suk Tan Chin refuses to believe that her brother is dead.
We are not giving up hope. Robert's family and friends love him very much. I just want to find my brother, and my brother Robert Chin. I want his life be accounted for. I want to find him and to know what happened to him.
The family of Carlos Segarra told me they feel the same, praying that perhaps he's lying unconscious in a hospital somewhere or under the rubble. Do you believe your father could still be alive?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's all we have is hope right now. I mean, we're doing everything we can, you know, providing every piece of information, calling every phone number, following every lead. That's all we have is hope in each other.
Pictures and descriptions of the missing are posted up on phone booths like this one, on walls and lampposts all over New York. Distraught relatives are clinging to any hope, however faint it may now be. And until they know for sure that their loved ones are not coming home, they cannot begin the long process of grieving. Some are in little doubt. Miracle.
Anyone there?
But after this disaster, miracles seem to be in short supply. On New York's Lexington Avenue, a pitiful sight. Relatives of the missing putting up photographs of their loved ones, hoping against hope that someone somewhere may have seen them alive. Suk Tan Chin refuses to believe that her brother is dead.
we are not giving up hope. Robert's family and friends love him very much. I just want to find my brother, and my brother Robert Chin. I want his life be accounted for. I want to find him and to know what happened to him.
The family of Carlos Segarra told me they feel the same, praying that perhaps he's lying unconscious in a hospital somewhere or under the rubble. Do you believe your father could still be alive?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's all we have is hope right now. I mean, we're doing everything we can, providing every piece of information, calling every phone number, following every lead. That's all we have is hope in each other.
Pictures and descriptions of the missing are posted up on phone booths like this one, on walls and lampposts all over New York. Distraught relatives are clinging to any hope, however faint it may now be. And until they know for sure that their loved ones are not coming home, they cannot begin the long process of grieving. Some are in little doubt their relatives are gone, including a brother of the chief executive of the big broking firm Cantor Fitzgerald.
He called my sister just after the plane hit, and he told her that he said that the smoke was pouring in. He was stuck in a corner office. There was no way out, and the smoke was coming in, and he's not good, and things are not good, and he's not going to make it. And he just wanted to say that he loved her, and he wanted to say goodbye, and tell her that he loved them. And then the phone went dead. So while I'm the head of the company, I'm trying to help my 700 employees who are missing their loved ones. I'm just another one of them. Just another one of them.
New Yorkers have been pouring into their churches for a day of remembrance and prayer, coming together to support each other at the end of a week that has terrorized and traumatized them. Americans finding comfort in services across the country. It's important to come here for you?
Oh yeah, it's a spiritual thing. I mean, all the souls and the lives were lost. It's just horrible. It's support of our country in America.
We want the world to see that we believe in God too, and that what was done downtown, they say it was in the name of God, but it was a godless thing to do.
And all over America, people are not only remembering the dead, they are preparing for war. A war against a terrorist enemy as yet unseen, but a war they are sure is coming. The mood here is of anguish and of grief, but also of surging national pride and defiance. Ben Brown, BBC News, New York.
Well, earlier the President authorised the call-up of 50,000 reservists. The last time there was such a call-up was during the Gulf War under his father's presidency. But speaking at a national memorial service, Mr. Bush said this time the enemy was waging war by stealth. From Washington, here's Stephen Sacco.
Storm clouds over Washington Cathedral. America grieving. Former presidents led the throng of dignitaries paying tribute to the thousands killed last Tuesday. Political differences don't matter now. The nation stands united.
Today we say to those who masterminded this cruel plot and to those who carried it out that the spirit of this nation will not be defeated by their twisted and diabolical schemes.
There is an enormous burden on the president's shoulders. He must reassure fearful Americans and guide the country's response.
Our responsibility to history is already clear. To answer these attacks and rid the world of evil. War has been waged against us by stealth and deceit and murder. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger.
And inside America's military headquarters, now operational despite the gaping wound, there is plenty of anger. Military chiefs here have called up over 35,000 reservists. It's the most tangible sign yet that the Bush administration is putting this country on a war footing. But it will be a war unlike any seen before. Nonetheless, there is a tempting model for the Bush team, the 1991 Gulf War. After all, Secretary of State Colin Powell was military chief then. Vice President Dick Cheney was Defense Secretary. The two had their differences, but both emerged believing if America fights, it must use overwhelming force. So today, America's inexperienced president is hearing a hawkish message from all of his most influential advisors. No Clinton-style token airstrikes, instead plans for a concerted assault on the terror groups and the countries which host them.
In our response, we will have to take into account not only the perpetrators, but those who provide haven, support, inspiration, financial, and other assets to the perpetrators.
U.S. Marines in training, currently on high alert along with all U.S. forces around the world. The Bush team has set itself and the military the most ambitious of targets, victory over world terrorism. It won't come quickly and it won't come cheap. Many lives are on the line. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
London, Paris, Berlin and Brussels all fell silent this morning as countries across Europe joined America to pay tribute to those who died. At 11 o'clock in Britain, hundreds of thousands stopped what they were doing and observed 3 minutes silence. An hour later, the Queen was joined by the Prime Minister at a special service of remembrance in St Paul's Cathedral with members of the American community in Britain. Nicholas Witchell reports.
Perhaps not since the years immediately after the World Wars have so many been moved to join a collective act of remembrance. In the House of Commons, recalled from the summer recess, the noise of debate was stilled. In the city, where so many have lost friends and colleagues in New York dealing rooms, offices were silent. Several thousand gathered in Belfast, testament to the wishes of that city's silent majority to be rid of terrorism forever. In schools, this one was in Cardiff, children who've puzzled at the week's television pictures and their parents' preoccupation with them offered prayers for something better. And for once, this wasn't just one nation remembering its own. It was virtually an entire continent offering solidarity to another across the Atlantic. An estimated 200,000 gathered near the Brandenburg Gate in the German capital, Berlin. In Paris, France's act of remembrance was led by the President Jacques Chirac. It was a day when many people, from heads of state to thousands of members of the public, wept for such senseless slaughter. At St Paul's Cathedral, the Queen was visibly moved during a service attended by hundreds of members of the American community who live in Britain. A large crowd of those who couldn't join the congregation inside the cathedral followed the service outside. The Archbishop of Canterbury said a senseless evil had been perpetrated against America and the free world.
As we battle with evil, our goal must be a world where such violence is a thing of the past.
Those responsible for this week's attacks, said the Archbishop, must be held to account. The final hymn, appropriately perhaps, was the battle hymn of the Republic. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Tony Blair described those responsible for the attacks as enemies of the civilised world. In an emergency debate in the House of Commons, he said the tragedy was of epoch-making proportions and it was time for the world to unite against terrorism. Our political editor Andrew Marr watched the debate.
Attention switched to Parliament today, recalled to hear that Britain has joined a new war against global terrorism in solidarity with her closest and most powerful ally.
Our objective will be to bring to account those who have organised, aided, abetted and incited this act of infamy. And those that harbour or help them have a choice, either to cease their protection of our enemies or be treated as an enemy themselves.
In almost apocalyptic terms, this country is being warned to cast aside its sense of safety.
People who have the fanaticism and the capability to fly an airliner laden with passengers and fuel into a skyscraper will not be deterred by human decency from deploying chemical or biological weapons, missiles or nuclear weapons, or other forms of mass destruction if these are available to them.
For the struggle against this threat, the new Tory leader handed the government a blank cheque.
There may be some who counsel caution over the full measure of support that the Prime Minister has already announced. In contrast, I would like to say and to assure the Prime Minister that he, throughout, will have our total backing in maintaining his position of unflinching support for the United States in its search for the perpetrators and subsequent actions.
At this moment, party politics has been obliterated. Almost everybody had a similar message, including this Muslim MP.
And would he further assure this House that it would be quite wrong for the British Muslims to be tarred with the same brush for following this dreadful act of terrorism? Thank you.
But it was a debate, not quite a chorus. There were a few lonely, angry voices of dissent.
If you launch a devastating attack upon a Muslim country, killing thousands, you will make 10,000 bin Ladens rise up in the stead of the one whose head you have cut off. I don't know what you'll bomb in Afghanistan, the Stone Age country that we helped to create.
A rare warning, the Prime Minister had most MPs at his back as he left to talk tactics with President Bush and turned today's words into actions. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
And Andrew joins us now from Downing Street. Andrew, he's made what sounded like a landmark speech. How will it be followed up?
Well, there are clearly going to be dramatic actions. There will be military actions. They will probably be fairly drastic actions. Now, I might be misleading people, but I do not believe that anything of that nature will happen this weekend. For all practical purposes, the weekend does not exist here in Downing Street. Tony Blair is going to be staying here and working pretty much flat out. There's an intense amount of diplomatic activity going on. He's going to be talking to the Americans, the Europeans, but also to Arab leaders, putting together a kind of coalition for whatever follows. Now, it's not going to be, as I say, I think an early strike. I think the first thing that's going to happen is the Americans in particular will produce their evidence. If it's Osama bin Laden that they feel is responsible, they will produce that evidence and they will then challenge the Taliban government in Afghanistan to produce him, and any more drastic action will follow that. So a busy weekend, but not, I think, a dramatic or bloody one.
Andrew Marr, thank you. FBI investigators searching for clues about the identity of those responsible said tonight they'd already received 36,000 leads. Earlier today, they named the 19 hijackers believed to be responsible and revealed they found important flight information from one of the crash sites.
The investigation is already producing critical results. At the Pentagon, 2 black boxes, the flight recorders from the plane which crashed there, were discovered in the early hours today. These could reveal when the cockpit was taken over by hijackers and even a motive or clues as to who is behind the attacks.
Those boxes must be downloaded and the data taken off to determine whether or not any real damage has occurred. And I do not know what the status of the boxes are right now, other than the fact that they are now part of the federal investigation into this horrible incident.
More news today on this suspected hijacker. The FBI say Mohammed Atta took a refresher course in flying in Florida last week. The investigators have now released the names of 19 suspected hijackers, all with Middle Eastern names. 17 lived in America, 1 in Saudi, and 1 hasn't been traced. 7 were trained pilots. The FBI has also just issued a list of more than 100 people it wants to question.
Now, the nature of this list is that it would be changing constantly as people are either removed from it or added to it. But we believe that the individuals on the list may have information that could be helpful to us in our efforts.
Are you the brother, sir?
Across the world, there have been arrests. In the Philippines, this man, suspected of being the relative of a suspect, has been questioned. Others have been arrested in Europe. Intelligence agencies worldwide want information on who ordered the attacks.
There was somebody behind it, almost certainly in North America, who pressed the button on Tuesday and said, today is the day we go. But of course then the question is, where did that person get their money? Where did they get their motivation? Where did they get their strategic requirement to go and do this terrible thing? And that may lead, of course, much further afield.
In America, several people have been questioned on information from the FBI. Intelligence agencies here are helping too, sifting through their reports of the last 6 months, hoping with hindsight they'll bring new clues. Teams of people here at MI5 are now working round the clock. They're in close contact with other European intelligence agencies and with the CIA and FBI. The aim to try and prevent any further terrorist attack and to close in on the network of people behind the American atrocities. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News, MI5 headquarters.
The ruling Taliban in Afghanistan have repeated their claim that Washington's prime suspect, Osama bin Laden, had nothing to do with the attacks. But the fact that Washington is pointing the finger at Afghanistan means a nervous time for its neighbour Pakistan. The government there doesn't want to alienate its own supporters or Washington, as our World Affairs editor John Simpson now reports from Peshawar.
This is a frontier town, one of the most densely packed places on earth. Peshawar seethes with humanity. Afghan refugees have crammed in here in their hundreds of thousands. The locals too are mostly from the same ethnic background. So in Peshawar there's an immense amount of sympathy for Afghanistan and none at all for any military action by the Americans. The Leke Tea House is serving the milky tea Pakistanis love and doing a good trade. Zabid Khan, who's doing the pouring, says that if America attacked Afghanistan, it would be a crime. Inside, I found the customers in full agreement.
If America attacks Afghanistan Muslims, it will create a religious sect crisis in the world. That Christians or Jewish are crushing Muslims.
We would again request America not to launch missile or some sort of attacks, that sort of attack to destroy innocent people.
Given such opposition, can the Pakistan government force through a policy of helping the United States attack Afghanistan? A prominent local journalist thinks not.
They might not resort to demonstrations or violence, but they will not back the policies of the government, so again the government will be in trouble.
This is all starting to seem distinctly reminiscent of the events which led up to the Gulf War a decade ago. Then too, a peaceable, basically pro-Western country, Jordan, was sucked into the enmity between its neighbour, Iraq, and the United States. The government was under threat for quite a long time as a result. Pakistan's problems could be only just beginning. John Simpson, BBC News, Peshawar.
Muslim clerics in the Middle East have again condemned the terrorist attacks on the United States, but some said Israel's policies towards the Palestinians should also be called terrorism. With the peace process at a standstill and feelings of despair and anger running high, it's getting harder for moderate Palestinians to ally themselves to the West. From Jerusalem, our correspondent Matt Fry has been assessing the implications of the American attacks for Middle East peace.
They came to grieve and to be humbled. The Palestinians always expected to be outdone by America, but never when it came to suffering. More than 600 have died since the beginning of the Intifada a year ago. Perhaps 10 times as many were killed in 1 hour on one morning in America. This was a small gathering of the Palestinian elite, who knows how representative their grief is. But the authorities here are doing their best to feel America's pain. Yasser Arafat was moved to do what he had never done before, in public at least. With the cameras rolling, he gave blood, destined for New York. And if he looks worried, it's also because of this. The initial reaction to the catastrophe from one small group of Palestinians was joy, not grief. A demonstration of several thousand in Nablus adopted a similar tone, but that film was confiscated by the authorities. At the moment, little could do more to undermine the Palestinian cause. No one can hide the resentment left by decades of occupation. We went to the Ramallah checkpoint today. Cars wait an hour to travel a few meters. In the distance, Israeli soldiers take potshots at stone throwers. The checks are meant to prevent the suicide bombers, but for most, they're part of the humiliating grind of an occupation tolerated in their eyes by America.
The main reason of the disappointment with the United States policy is the bias to Israel and the continuous support to Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. This must end.
Tonight, the biggest rally ever held by Arab Israelis, condemning Israel and honoring those killed by the Israeli police. The Intifada has turned moderates into radicals and the rest of the Arab world into unwilling allies for President Bush's war on terrorism. Had it not been for the festering wound of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the terrible events in America, thousands of miles from here, may never have taken place. This is where it all began, and this is where it all has to end. Not with an escalation, but with a solution. The next few weeks may decide which one it is to be. Matt Fry, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Now for the latest, I'm joined by our World Affairs editor John Simpson in Islamabad, Stephen Sacker, who's outside the damaged Pentagon building, and here in the studio by our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins. But Stephen, first, after all the mayhem and the bad press America's intelligence services have had for not preventing these hijacks, do Americans feel that they're being well led in this crisis?
Well, Peter, first, I should say I'm outside the White House. I've moved from the Pentagon. I think Americans at the moment are focused on two things. One, paying their respects and grieving for the so many thousands of people who lost their lives last Tuesday, and that is a process that will continue as we learn more about the names, about the lives of the people that died. And second, concentrating on how exactly to respond. And in both areas, President Bush is crucial. And I would say we're seeing a different President Bush this week. For much of his first few months in office, he's been quite aloof. He hasn't shared his emotions very easily. He's been the anti-Clinton, not wanting to feel everyone's pain and show off in the way that he felt Bill Clinton did. Now he's changed. Today, for example, we've had him at the National Cathedral making a very strong, emotional speech. And now he's in New York on the rubble, sharing the pain of the rescue workers there. And I think people like that. So I think Americans for the moment are reassured about Bush's leadership, but in the end, they'll judge him by results, and that means they'll judge him by the success of his plan to combat global terror.
But he relies on his big national agencies. Is there any confidence that the CIA, having been on bin Laden's trail for some years, can actually lay a finger on him?
Well, that, I think, is where Americans should be concerned. We learn from security sources that there have been covert CIA operations, extensive operations, designed to thwart and block Osama bin Laden and his network since 1998. And what have they achieved? Well, on the face of it, very little. And if, as most American officials seem to believe, Osama bin Laden's network was behind Tuesday's attacks, then one has to say that the CIA, the intelligence community, the FBI, they have all failed and failed terribly. Now we're talking about a military operation, whether it be based in the Middle East or in Pakistan or directly in Afghanistan against bin Laden, which would be massive in its scope, but in the end has to find shadowy terrorists. Can the Americans really deliver? We'll only find out over the next few months, maybe even years. It's going to take a long time. But clearly, whatever military might America brings to bear, it is not going to be easy.
Stephen Sacker in Washington, thank you. John Simpson in Islamabad, do the Taliban appreciate just how serious a situation they're in by harbouring bin Laden?
I don't think they have the faintest idea, Peter, what's going to happen to them, frankly. Their only idea about wars is the Russian invasion, which was brutal and not very imaginative, not very difficult to combat, and the missiles which the Americans fired at them in 1998, some of which just hit empty ground. I don't think they know what modern warfare's like, what we saw in the Gulf, for instance, what we saw in Belgrade and Serbia. So I think that's going to be a problem. But It's also, interestingly, a problem for the United States, because this is one of the poorest, weakest, feeblest countries in the world. What's it going to look like, really, if the most powerful nation on earth grinds them into powder? And if they don't do it in that form and they send troops in, well, whose troops? Because, frankly, American troops aren't terribly good at that kind of thing. What will they do? Use European troops? Will they use bases in Pakistan with all the opposition there? There's an awful lot of unanswered questions at the moment.
John Simpson in Islamabad, thank you. And now James Robbins in the studio here. James, a lot of talk of war, mainly by politicians. Are they just speaking in anger, or will someone somewhere soon be looking down the barrel of a gun?
No, someone will be looking down the barrel of a gun. I think it will be the Taliban and bin Laden and all those who have supported and harboured him. But I think it's going to be a totally different sort of war. So much has changed this week. It's a war which will be limited but hugely supported, I think. Tony Blair has pledged British support, NATO has pledged its support, British ships are on the move, British troops will be on the move soon, so will other nations. America is succeeding in building a coalition, an extraordinary new sort of coalition. After all, Russia has come out in support, China too has come out in support. They all fear global terror and they see its real dangers. We don't know what sort of war it will be, but there will be a conflict and it will be long.
So, politicians, they've made speeches in the past about terrorism, they've passed laws about it. This is different.
This is absolutely different. I don't think we can exaggerate how much has changed this week. Tony Blair made it very clear in the Commons today that all those who harbour or support terrorists are going to be targets, and those who do not support the war against terror make themselves our enemies, he said. So that could hardly be clearer. And I think one other thing worth picking up from that debate, Jack Straw, very historical, saying it's as if we were back in the 1930s. We mustn't take the risk of appeasing terrorism as we appeased Hitler. We have to stand and fight.
James, thank you. And this evening, British Airways and Virgin Atlantic have been told they can resume flights to the United States of America. The first planes are due to leave Heathrow shortly. Now, some of the day's other news. There was a nervous day on the stock markets of London and the rest of Europe. Here, the index of 100 leading shares slumped by more than 187, wiping
at 10:30. And that's after an extended 10 o'clock news, now on BBC1 with George Alagaya.
The war on terrorism begins. America and Britain strike Afghanistan. The first signs of battle. Cruise missiles head for targets over Kabul. President Bush says the campaign will be sustained, comprehensive and relentless. Tony Blair confirms British involvement, calling it a moment of utmost gravity. Bin Laden's pre-prepared response, he calls it an attack on Islam. And in Panorama, after the news, John Simpson is back in Afghanistan to describe the country's journey back to the Dark Ages. Good evening. 26 days after the attacks on New York and Washington, America and Britain have begun the military campaign against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban regime. President George Bush said it's the beginning of a sustained, comprehensive and relentless campaign against the terrorist network. Tony Blair, speaking in Downing Street, said there were three parts to the operation: military, diplomatic and humanitarian. Osama bin Laden, in a pre-recorded statement, said that the war against Afghanistan was a war on Islam itself. Operation Enduring Freedom began shortly after 5:30 p.m. with 50 cruise missiles fired from US ships and British submarines. They were stationed in the Arabian Sea. Their target, the Taliban's key bases. At 3 minutes to 6, Kandahar Airport was the first place reported hit. At 6:12, it was reported Kabul Airport had also been bombed. By 6:20, US planes had struck targets south of Jalalabad, aiming for 3 of Osama bin Laden's camps. Our first report is from Stephen Saka in Washington.
9 o'clock in the evening, just outside Kabul. Cameras from an Arab TV station captured these murky images, flashes apparently from the Taliban's rudimentary air defenses. US-led strikes were underway, and within 30 minutes in Washington, President Bush addressed the nation.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
The White House now home to a president directing a war. The target, the al-Qaeda network, its training camps and communications.
Initially, the terrorists may burrow deeper into caves and other entrenched hiding places. Our military action is also designed to clear the way for sustained, comprehensive, and relentless operations to drive them out and bring them to justice.
Not once did the president mention Osama bin Laden by name. The Americans don't want to personalize their global war on terror.
Every nation has a choice to make. In this conflict, there is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves, and they will take that lonely path at their own peril.
On Al Jazeera television, moments later, a dramatic taped message from Osama bin Laden and his key associates. Bush, bin Laden said it was time to take sides.
The world is divided into two sides. The side of faith and the side of infidelity. Now, every Muslim has to stand up and support Islam and support Muslim brothers in order to wipe out this act of aggression.
Much of Operation Enduring Freedom, as it's called, is likely to be covert. Today, cameras caught this U.S. transport plane thought to be taking elite U.S. troops into Afghanistan's neighbor, Uzbekistan. At the Pentagon, today's strikes were described as the initial phase of a sustained operation using all the instruments of U.S. power.
The fact is, in this battle against terrorism, there is no silver bullet. There is no single thing that is going to suddenly make that threat disappear. Ultimately, they're going to collapse from within.
Tonight, the confusing, grainy picture from Kabul. The war has started, but from here, it's impossible to see how it will end. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
Now, our correspondents are in northern Afghanistan for the major developments on the ground. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is in the mountains north of Kabul. Our special correspondent, Ben Brown, is in the town of Talkun. First, to John Simpson. He joins me on a video phone link. There is a delay on the line. John, what's the role, do you think, of the Northern Alliance now? Simply to take advantage of what's going on, or are they an integral part of the attack?
No, I don't think they're in any sense an integral part of the attack. They haven't got the weapons, they've not been supplied, they don't have the kind of training or anything like it. I think they're simply going to take advantage of what happens. And we'll wait to see, perhaps in the second phase of bombing, whether the Americans and the British choose to attack the Taliban front lines. If they do, then presumably the Northern Alliance people will just simply have a walkover.
John, you won't have seen this, but Osama bin Laden has provided a pre-recorded statement to an Arab television station. What do you make of that?
Well, I was at that television station not very long ago, just a matter of a couple of weeks ago, Al Jazeera in Kabul. They've got very close links with Osama bin Laden, and they've been careful to foster those links. It looked to me very much as though he had supplied them with a pre-recorded message, which they were to play directly. They heard the news of the bombing. And I think that's exactly what he chose to do. It's a clever move, typical of the man, and it will no doubt have some effect, some of the effect he wants.
John Simpson, thank you very much. Let's go to Ben Brown now, who's also in northern Afghanistan. Ben, the Taliban regime, we've described it before as being in the dark ages, facing weapons from the 21st century. Can they really be expected to retaliate?
Well, they can try. They're saying that they're going to fight to the last breath, but they don't really have that much to fight with, George. They have, or should I say they had, an air force, helicopters and a few planes, But we think that that has been the first priority of the American-led attack, to destroy those planes and helicopters and to destroy the Taliban's air defences, such as they were, to give the Americans total air supremacy.
Ben, the Sunday Express reporter Yvonne Ridley was due to have been released today. What can you tell us about her fate?
Well, it is difficult, obviously, with these attacks. She was, as you say, due to be released today. Then we heard that that was maybe going to be put off till tomorrow. Now, of course, these attacks may or may not put a different complexion on that. We're still hoping she's going to be released perhaps in the next 24 hours. The worst fear, of course, is that with these attacks, the Taliban may change their mind, may renege on their commitment and may use her as some kind of hostage. There isn't, I should say, any evidence of that so far. We are still hoping very much that she will be released in the next 24 hours.
All right, Ben, thank you very much. Now, our correspondent Stephen Sacker, who's in Washington. Stephen, I listened to all of George Bush's statement today. He talked about patience, not the quick fix that Americans may have got used to in the past.
That's right, George. It's become almost a cliche here that the American administration constantly repeats to the public that this is going to be a different kind of war, the like of which they have never seen before. And part of that is to tell the public that this will not be quick. It will not be the orthodox, conventional sort of strikes against armed forces that one can see on the ground, on territory that is quite clearly marked out. It's not going to be like that at all. And George Bush did emphasize again in that speech that once the initial air supremacy has been established, as Ben Brown pointed out, then it's going to be a question of going in and getting shadowy terrorists in difficult terrain. He's used the phrase before, smoking them out. And that still, I think, is the way the Americans see it. In the end, they will have to smoke out Osama bin Laden and his key associates.
Stephen, George Bush also spoke about today the battle being in Afghanistan, but it will end up being broader. What do you make of that?
There's two ways of looking at that, George. One quite simple way is to say, well, Al-Qaeda has tentacles. This network has tentacles all over the world. The Americans reckon it has operations in up to 60 countries. So clearly, using law enforcement as well as the military, they're going to have to tackle that network. But also, there is still a question here about how far the global war against terror goes. There are still voices here who say this isn't just about Afghanistan, the Taliban, or Osama bin Laden. It's about countries like Iraq as well.
Stephen, thank you. Tony Blair said Britain has no hesitation in joining with the US in the coalition and would act with reason and resolve in the war against terrorism. Parliament is being recalled tomorrow for a debate on Britain's involvement. Speaking from Downing Street, he praised the courage and determination of those taking part in the action and said Britain will back the coalition until all its objectives are achieved.
There are three parts, all equally important to the operation in which we're engaged: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. The military action we are taking will be targeted against places we know to be involved in the Al-Qaeda network of terror or against the military apparatus of the Taliban. This military plan has been put together mindful of our determination to do all we humanly can to avoid civilian casualties. We have set the objectives: to eradicate Osama bin Laden's network of terror and to take action against the Taliban regime that is sponsoring him. As to the precise British involvement, I can confirm that last Wednesday, the United States government made a specific request that a number of UK military assets be used in the operation which has now begun, and I gave authority for these assets to be deployed. The world understands that whilst, of course, there are dangers in acting, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat of further such outrages, the threat to our economies, the threat to the stability of the world. On the humanitarian front, we are assembling a coalition of support for refugees in and outside Afghanistan, which is as vital as the military coalition. This, of course, is a moment of the utmost gravity for the world. None of the leaders involved in this action want war. None of our nations want it. We are a peaceful people. But we know that sometimes, to safeguard peace, we have to fight. So we will act, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full. Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by our political editor, Andrew Marr, from Downing Street. Andrew, looking back at the last week, Tony Blair's taken as prominent a role, perhaps, as George Bush. It's a very bold strategy, isn't it?
It's bold, it's hugely ambitious. He's been going around the world helping to put together this massive coalition and very much deliberately put himself and therefore Britain at the forefront of all of this. Because it's ambitious, it is risky. The worst thing that could happen, I suppose, would be missiles going astray, lots of civilians being killed in Afghanistan, and getting exactly what Osama bin Laden wants, which is a cycle of violence ending up in a general conflict between Islam on the one hand and the West on the other. That would be catastrophic, and that's why Tony Blair has also been very keen to say tonight that he is personally angry about the use of the phrase Islamic terrorist. This is not a war against Islam.
Andrew, I spoke just now to Stephen Sack in Washington, asking him about the limits to this operation. He thought that President Bush felt it was wider than Afghanistan. What's the view from Downing Street?
The view from Downing Street is that it's not wider than Afghanistan in terms of looking at other countries like Iraq or Syria or anywhere else, because they want this to be a war against terrorists, a war against Al-Qaeda and the people responsible. They want it to be limited to them and the Taliban supporters, not at this stage to go any further. That would be hugely dangerous.
Andrew, thank you. It's taken over 3 weeks for Britain and America to build up their forces in the region. Tens of thousands of military personnel from both countries are there. David Shukman looks at the troops and weapons available to the coalition's commanders.
This is one of the British submarines that took part in the first attacks tonight. We filmed this one a few days ago, quietly slipping away from an exercise off Oman. Her plans then were secret. This footage of a test firing of a British cruise missile shows how the weapons are meant to steer themselves to their targets. They aren't always that accurate, but their use tonight is intended to minimize civilian casualties. What Pentagon commanders are trying to achieve in this first phase is to make the airspace safe for bigger operations to come. They've got 2 aircraft carriers in the region. They've been involved tonight, and others are on the way, one carrying special forces rather than planes. There are submarines with them which fired cruise missiles, and there's the Royal Navy's carrier Illustrious with submarines, which were the first British units to be directly involved. B-52 bombers were launched from the island of Diego Garcia down in the Indian Ocean, and B-2 stealth bombers came all the way from America. But this is only the start. The key is to get special forces into Afghanistan itself. The Pentagon talked tonight of mounting operations in the air and on the ground. They also say there's one war we can see, another that we can't. In these latest pictures of America's long-range bombers, the emphasis is on firepower. But what this campaign most critically needs is accuracy, to avoid the casualties that'll undermine the coalition and to clear the way for special forces to track down Osama bin Laden. And that's what'll be hardest to achieve. David Shukman, BBC News.
The attacks were aimed at specific targets in Afghanistan. America said its aim was to hurt the terrorists' ability to operate while minimizing the risk to civilians. Here's David Loyne.
These are the main targets in the new war. Islamic fundamentalists recruited from across the world and trained by Osama bin Laden with the knowledge of his host, the Taliban. The Taliban are paying a heavy price for their hospitality. This is what Kabul looked like before the American raids, ruined by a quarter of a century of war. But although a Taliban spokesman said the attacks have caused no significant damage, the Afghans have never faced such high-technology weapons as they did tonight. The first attacks hit the capital Kabul, and soon after there were attacks on Kandahar, the spiritual headquarters of the Taliban, and Jalalabad in the east, and bin Laden's training camps nearby. The training camps are the main target of the raids, which were also aimed at communications and the Taliban's few fighter planes, and at air defense installations.
These efforts are designed to disrupt and destroy terrorist activities in Afghanistan and to set the conditions for future military action, as well as to bring much-needed food and medical aid to the people of Afghanistan. I want to remind you that while today's operations are visible, many other operations may not be so visible.
This brutal attack
In Islamabad, Taliban diplomats condemned the attacks, claiming to have shot down a plane, but they won't allow independent journalists in to see it. While Taliban fighters will now be deciding whether to fight or change sides, particularly in the northern town of Mazar-e-Sharif, the town under most pressure from opposition forces, because in the end this battle will have to be won on the ground. Several dozen cruise missiles were sent into Afghanistan in 1998 by President Clinton, causing no significant damage and only hardening opposition to America because one hit a mosque. In this new kind of war, it may be some time before we see even this much evidence. David Loyne, BBC News.
Let's join our correspondent Kate Adie now, who's with some British forces based off the coast of Oman. Kate, so far these British troops are on exercise. Is their status likely to change now?
It's said at the moment, no. There are no orders which have gone out to alter their position. They're on a long-planned exercise, 3.5 years in planning. Here they are, both naval forces at sea and a lot of soldiers on land, 23,000 troops in all. The tension in the air is rising a little. We saw very short time after the attacks were announced that a number of personnel who were enjoying an evening out around Muscat here in Oman suddenly slipped away back to their bases.
Kate, is there any doubt in your mind that these troops, the troops that you've been with, are the kind of troops that may be needed if this thing were to go on and change its nature?
We don't know how long this is going to go on for. They're certainly not configured for the attack that is taking place. The 3 submarines which have taken part, which are Trafalgar, Superb and Triumph. I watched Trafalgar go out to sea on Wednesday. That was the day when the US asked for that specific kind of asset. They were involved in the attack this evening. 1 fired cruise missiles, we know that. But other than that small group, that is as far as the involvement goes at the moment. But that's all we can say.
Kate Adie, thank you. And in the past few minutes, we've been getting reports of a second attack on the Afghan capital, Kabul. Details are very sketchy, but a Taliban official was quoted as saying the attacks had been renewed, and witnesses spoke of at least 1 strong explosion. President Bush said that Canada, Australia, Germany and France had pledged forces to fight alongside America and Britain in the days and weeks ahead. Moscow said that they had been warned in advance of the attacks. But already the assaults on Afghanistan have been strongly attacked by Iran, Iraq and pro-Taliban supporters within Pakistan.
In Pakistan tonight, as people take in the news, small groups of bin Laden supporters are insisting they're not defeated. But Pakistan's government is relying on the great mass of its people backing the country's U-turn, turning against the Taliban and falling in behind American-led strikes. Throughout the Muslim world, reaction to the first military strikes will be critically important. The most obvious winners already tonight are the anti-Taliban forces in northern Afghanistan. After years failing to dislodge the Taliban from 90% of Afghanistan, now the United States and the Allies are doing that job for them. This northern alliance is guaranteed at least a place in any post-Taliban government. With some British forces already in action and more support promised to President Bush, Russia and the European Union have given strong backing to the strikes. And France announced tonight it will be supplying active military support within days.
The people of Afghanistan have suffered for the past 20 years. Now they are victims of a barbarous regime, and everything must be done to respond to the humanitarian crisis, to help them, and to improve the future development of Afghanistan.
That emphasis on helping, not hurting innocent civilians explains the enormous international aid effort which is now being accelerated. The United States will start airdrops. Major international agencies will try to step up conventional convoys to reach as many of the starving as possible. Even so, one Islamic government in Iran is already criticizing the airstrikes. Washington needs to keep the coalition together.
This is a unique situation on the day that the U.S. has launched these airstrikes on Taliban military capabilities. It's also begun a massive humanitarian airdrop.
In Israel tonight, there's extra nervousness among people who fear they could be the target of new waves of attacks. Israel's government, after a bruising battle of words with President Bush, is now stressing its full support for the hunt for bin Laden.
Well, we shall see who will be punished. Is it Satan?
the man who killed 6,000 innocent people, and he wants to kill more. We have to get rid of him as soon as possible.
But beyond that goal, already Afghans fiercely opposed to the Taliban are dreaming of a stable future after the war. These crowds in the Pakistani town of Quetta were rallying behind their exiled king. The United Nations hope he will play a part, leading efforts to give the country just and popular government. But it will be a long and uncertain process. James Robbins, BBC News.
In New York, security has been increased after the airstrikes on Afghanistan. The city's mayor said new measures had been implemented. With the ruins of Ground Zero still smouldering, many New Yorkers say the bombing couldn't be avoided.
Since September the 11th, work's been going on steadily clearing Ground Zero. As the retaliation started, the US authorities went on alert for more attacks in America.
Basically, the core of the plan is that there's a significant additional number of armed police officers, members of the National Guard who will be guarding sensitive areas that we think might be subject to attack.
New Yorkers, still grieving, did what they do in times of crisis. They come to Times Square in New York to talk about events as they unfold. It's the city's, perhaps the nation's, public forum.
It's obvious that it's necessary that we have to take an action, but it doesn't make me feel good that people are going to die.
I think they are right to bomb. Yes, they are, because of all the problems going on over there. I mean, it's not as if they're just like a religious group. They're like using like drugs to like get money to fund their actions, and so I mean they're affecting the entire world.
As the attack started, there were new security measures in New York. Some of the main streets like Broadway here were closed. It's impossible to know what New Yorkers make of it, or Americans. All the opinion polls, though, up until the attack, gave overwhelming approval to President Bush. Stephen Evans, BBC News, New York.
And there is only one other main news story this evening. 5 years after it was privatised, Railtrack, the company that owns Britain's railway network, has collapsed. A High Court judge has granted the government permission to appoint administrators who are now running the company's affairs. Railtrack had debts of more than £3 billion. Shareholders have lost most or all of their money.
Lawyers arriving for the High Court hearing. It heard how Railtrack was going broke. The government QC, David Richards, said Railtrack needed another £2.3 billion, which it was highly unlikely to raise. Justice Gavin Lightman signed the administration order, saying it was not only appropriate but absolutely essential. The crunch came after the government refused Railtrack any more support on Friday night.
I said no more bailouts for Railtrack, no more last-minute rescue plans funded by the taxpayer. The time has come to put the travelling public first. This means the end of Railtrack. It means a new beginning for our railways.
Speaking exclusively to the BBC, Railtrack accused the government of going back on a deal to support the company.
They cancelled the flow of several £100 million of money that had been previously agreed in the spring, and they said that the position of the regulator would be changed, so flows of money through him would be stopped, if necessary, through Act of Parliament.
The administrators say there'll be no redundancies or pay cuts for Railtrack's 11,000 staff. The network will keep running until a non-profit-making company is set up to take over. It'll have members instead of shareholders, including train operators, unions and the National Passenger Watchdog.
It's a bold move by government, but I think that effectively they probably made up their mind that they couldn't continue to throw money into a black hole, and that Railtrack had to be re-anchored, as we have always said, as a public service rail provider.
Tonight, this company has effectively ceased to exist. The investors who stampeded to buy shares 5 years ago and who believed the government could never let Railtrack die have discovered a harsh truth. There's no such thing as a certain bet. Simon Montague, BBC News, at the headquarters of what was Railtrack.
Now let's get the latest on the weather with Isabel Lang. Isabel.
Thanks, George. Evening to you. It's been thoroughly miserable across the south today. We've had an active storm coming from the Atlantic. It's brought with it severe gales, torrential rain. We've had damage to power lines, trees down. It really has been awful. And in fact, it's still quite bad out there now. Just south of the low centre, that's where we're seeing a real squeeze in the isobar. Some very strong winds across the Cardigan Bay area, gusts of 60 to 70 miles an hour. Very gusty through the English Channel and also along the east coast too, up towards Bridlington. Now the rain's still with us. Thankfully it's turned a little bit more showery now in the south, although still some heavy showers. The more organised rain then stretches from Wales right across the Irish Sea into Northern Ireland and up into northern England and southern Scotland. And here there's some very nasty conditions if you're travelling with a lot of rain, still some very heavy downpours on that front. And that'll continue to track its way northwards through tonight and keep things very showery across southern Britain. Now it'll stay pretty showery for the next 24 hours across parts of the south, and after such a wet day today we could have problems with flooding. And here's a reminder of the floodline number 0845 988 1188. The main risk, I should think, across the south, something we'll be following. For Monday's forecast then, a lot of showers in the south, heavy, thundery, squally winds as well. Further to the north we've got low pressure slap bang over Scotland, so rain or showers across Scotland, northern England and Northern Ireland, just little bits of dry weather now and again. And really quite a disappointing day temperature wise in the north at 13, maybe 16 or 17 in the south, and a showery week. That's it.
Isabel, thank you. Now the headlines. The war on terrorism has begun. Reports are coming in now that America and Britain have launched a second wave of airstrikes on the Afghan capital, Kabul. 5 hours ago, the first signs of battle. Cruise missiles head for targets over Afghanistan. President Bush says the campaign will be sustained, comprehensive and relentless. Tony Blair confirms British forces were involved, calling it a moment of utmost gravity. That's the latest news tonight. You can follow all the developments over on BBC News 24, now here on BBC1.